And for that, as so often, you find a starting project attached, download it, extract it, run npm install, and then npm run serve once you installed all dependencies. And this brings up the development server. Once this is up and running, this is what you should see on the screen. Now here I prepared a very basic form for us. We got an input field for a text here, an input field for a number. We got a drop down, we got some checkboxes, and we got some radio buttons, and then also a button to submit the form. Now let's first of all focus on how we can connect Vue to all those inputs and get information out of these inputs, since this is probably something you'll need a lot in apps you're building. Let's thereafter talk about form validation and how we can add basic validation here. And let's at the end also build our own form control. But step by step. Here's the form.vue file, and here you see all the markup for the form you see here on the screen. Now this component has no script logic at the moment. It just has a template and some styles. So let's actually get started by adding a script object, and let's start by extracting some data out of these inputs. And for the moment, I will simply log that data to the console so that we see that extraction worked. So we will need a method for that, of course, which is triggered when the form is submitted, and I'll name it submit form. That's my method name, and that's something we already did in this course. We can now trigger this method here when this form is submitted. We could also add a click listener to the button we have here, but since buttons inside of forms submit those forms and trigger the submit events, you typically want to listen to those submit events instead. And here, that's also something you already saw quite a bit in this course. Here, you typically add the prevent modifier to ensure that when form submission occurs, we don't have that browser default, which would be that a request is sent and which would therefore result in a page reload, which in the end restarts our Vue app and we therefore lose all our data. That's definitely not what we want. So here I want to trigger the submit form method, and now let's see how we can connect Vue to those different inputs. Now let's start with the text input here for the name. We have two main ways of getting data out of such an input. Option one is that we use vModel or our own custom input event listener, for example, to listen to every keystroke and store what the user entered in some data property with every keystroke. This is perfectly fine and especially useful if you maybe also want to validate this input on every keystroke to show an error message even before the user tried to submit anything. In addition, if you use vModel, you of course have two-way binding, which can also help with resetting the form. With two-way binding, you can not just listen to what the user entered, but you can also overwrite what's in the form, and you can change the value which is stored in the input. And that also can be helpful. And actually, that is what I will do here. I will add a couple of data properties, and therefore we need this data option in our component configuration object here. And I will start by adding a data property for this name input I have up here for the username. So let's go down here and let's add a username field. This name, of course, is totally up to you. You can name it whatever you want, but I'll name it username since I'm going to store a username in here. And I'll start with an empty string as an initial value. Now we can bind this with vModel here to this input. And that means that Vue will automatically detect every keystroke, update the value stored in username, but when, on the other hand, we change what's stored in username with our code, for example, when the form is submitted and we reset the value, then our change will also be reflected in this input. And that's something we can test here. We're now storing this in username, So now in submit form, we can of course console log username. So output that we're going to print the username and then output the concrete values stored in username. And thereafter, I'll set this username back to an empty string, effectively resetting what the user entered. If we now save all of that and open up the developer tools, I can enter max here in this name field. And if I click save data, you see username maxed, so using the value worked, and you see the input field is empty now because I did set username back to an empty string here. And that is all something you learned already, I'm aware of that, but this is the foundation of working with user input. Now, let's build up on that foundation, let's learn more about vModel, and let's learn how we can extract values from these other control types here.